Sarah stared in disbelief as the floodwaters surged through the doors of the HOA meeting hall. Just hours ago, they had forced her to block the drainage from her roof, ignoring her warnings about the consequences. Now their arrogance had come back to haunt them, washing away their carefully curated image of control. As the panicked shrieks echoed through the hall, Sarah couldn't help but feel a twinge of satisfaction. Sometimes, karma had a way of delivering its own brand of justice. The HOA meeting had been tense from the moment Sarah walked through the doors. Ever since she had moved into the neighborhood, the board members had seemed determined to make her life miserable. From petty complaints about her lawn to absurd fines for minor violations, they had made it clear that she was an outsider who didn't fit their vision of the perfect community. Today's meeting, however, was the final straw. Sarah had received a letter demanding that she immediately block the drainage pipe from her roof, citing concerns about water runoff and potential damage to the community's infrastructure. The letter was signed by the HOA president, Thomas, a man whose disdain for Sarah was barely concealed beneath his veneer of civility. "This is completely unreasonable," Sarah argued, her voice rising. "My roof drains into a public storm sewer. Blocking it will just cause flooding on my property and potentially damage my home." Thomas leaned back in his chair, a smug expression on his face. "The board has reviewed the matter, and we've determined that the risk to the community outweighs your individual concerns. You have 2 weeks to comply, or we'll have no choice but to take further action." Sarah felt her blood boil. This is nothing more than petty retaliation. "You're deliberately putting my home at risk because you don't like me. I won't do it, and you can't force me to." The other board members murmured in agreement, their eyes glinting with a mix of superiority and indignation. Sarah knew she was fighting a losing battle, but she refused to back down. "I'm warning you, Thomas," she said, her voice laced with a mix of desperation and defiance. "If you force me to block that drainage pipe, it's going to come back to haunt you. You have no idea what kind of disaster you're unleashing." Thomas waved a dismissive hand. "The decision has been made, Miss Blackwood. You have 2 weeks to comply, or we'll have no choice but to take legal action. Now, if there's nothing else, I'd like to move on to the next item on the agenda." As the meeting droned on, Sarah sat in stony silence, her mind racing with a mix of fury and dread. She knew that what the HOA was demanding was not only unreasonable, but potentially catastrophic. But as she looked around the room, she realized that none of them seemed to care about the consequences. They were blinded by their own sense of power and control, and they were willing to sacrifice her safety to maintain it. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of anxiety and dread for Sarah. Despite her repeated pleas and warnings, the HOA board refused to budge on their demand. They seemed determined to assert their authority, even if it meant putting her home at risk. As the deadline approached, Sarah knew she had to take matters into her own hands. She spent countless hours researching the local building codes and storm drainage regulations, looking for any legal loophole that could help her fight the HOA's directive. Finally, on the day of the deadline, Sarah arrived at the HOA meeting armed with a stack of documents and a steely determination. As Thomas called the meeting to order, she stood up and cleared her throat. "Mr. President, before we proceed, I have something I'd like to address." Her voice was calm and steady, but there was an underlying edge of defiance. Thomas sighed, as if he had been expecting this. "Yes, Ms. Blackwood. I've done my research, and I've found that the HOA's demand for me to block the drainage pipe from my roof is a direct violation of local building codes and stormwater management regulations." She held up the documents for emphasis. "I'm not going to do it, and if you try to force me, I'll have no choice but to take legal action." The board members exchanged uneasy glances, and Sarah could see the cracks in their veneer of confidence. Thomas, however, remained unfazed. "We've already made our decision, Ms. Blackwood. You have until the end of the day to comply, or we'll have no choice but to take the necessary steps to enforce it." Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline as she realized that her gambit had failed. She had hoped that the threat of legal action would give the HOA pause, but it was clear that they were willing to risk it all to maintain their control. "Then I'm afraid you leave me no choice," she said, her voice strained with emotion. "I won't block that drainage pipe, and if you try to force me, I'll have no choice but to take this to court." Thomas leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Is that a threat, Miss Blackwood?" "It's a promise," Sarah replied, her gaze unwavering. The tension in the room was palpable as the two parties stared each other down. Sarah knew that she was playing a dangerous game, but she also knew that she couldn't back down. The stakes were too high, and the consequences were too dire. As the meeting adjourned, Sarah watched the HOA board members file out, their faces etched with a mix of frustration and uncertainty. She knew that the battle had only just begun, but she was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. The next few days were a whirlwind of legal maneuvering and tense negotiations. Sarah had filed a formal complaint with the city's building and zoning department, outlining the HOA's unlawful demands and the potential consequences of blocking the drainage pipe. Meanwhile, the HOA board members were scrambling to find a way to enforce their decision without risking a costly legal battle. They had reached out to their own legal counsel, who had advised them that they were on shaky ground and that pursuing the matter further could potentially backfire. Despite the mounting pressure, neither side was willing to back down. Sarah was determined to protect her home and her family, while the HOA was equally resolute in maintaining their authority and control over the community. The tension came to a head during a heated phone call between Sarah and Thomas, the HOA president. "Ms. Blackwood, I'm warning you. If you don't comply with our directive by the end of the day, we'll have no choice but to take action." Sarah's voice was laced with a mixture of defiance and exasperation. "Thomas, you know this is illegal. If you force me to block that drainage pipe, it's going to cause serious flooding on my property. I won't do it, and if you try to make me, I'll have no choice but to take this to court." "I'm sorry, but the decision has been made," Thomas replied, his tone unyielding. "You have until 5 p.m. today to comply, or we'll be forced to take matters into our own hands." "You're making a huge mistake, Thomas," Sarah warned, her voice tinged with desperation. "If you do this, it's going to come back to haunt you. I'm telling you, the consequences are going to be disastrous." Thomas scoffed. "We'll take our chances, Miss Blackwood. The board has made its decision, and we're not backing down." With that, he abruptly ended the call, leaving Sarah staring at her phone in a mix of frustration and dread. As the day wore on, Sarah's anxiety continued to build. She knew that the HOA was serious about their threat, and she could already feel the weight of the impending disaster bearing down on her. If they forced her to block the drainage pipe, it would only be a matter of time before the water started to accumulate, and the consequences could be catastrophic. As the clock struck 5 p.m., Sarah steeled herself for the worst. She had done everything in her power to reason with the HOA, but it was clear that they were unwilling to listen. Now, all she could do was wait and hope that her dire warnings would somehow reach them before it was too late. As the sun began to set, Sarah heard a commotion outside her home. Peering through the window, she saw a group of men dressed in HOA uniforms approaching her property, carrying shovels and other tools. Her heart sank as she realized that the HOA had made good on their threat. They were going to force her to block the drainage pipe, no matter the consequences. Rushing outside, Sarah confronted the group, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and defiance. "What do you think you're doing? I already told you, I'm not going to block that drainage pipe. It's illegal, and it's going to cause serious flooding on my property." The men paused, exchanging uneasy glances. It was clear that they were uncomfortable with the task at hand, but they were bound by their loyalty to the HOA. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we have our orders," one of the men said, his voice tinged with a hint of regret. "We have to do this, whether you like it or not." Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief. "You can't be serious. Do you have any idea what's going to happen if you block that pipe?" It's going to flood my entire backyard, and possibly my basement too. I'm telling you, this is a disaster waiting to happen." The men hesitated, clearly unsure of how to proceed. Sarah could see the doubt in their eyes, and she knew that she had to seize the moment. "Look, I know you're just following orders, but you have to understand. This isn't just about me. It's about the entire community. If you block that drainage pipe, it's going to cause a major flooding problem that could affect dozens of homes. Is that really what you want to be responsible for?" The men exchanged more uneasy glances, and Sarah could see the wheels turning in their minds. She pressed on, her voice growing more urgent. "Please, you have to listen to me. I've done my research, and I know what I'm talking about. If you go through with this, you're going to regret it. I'm begging you, don't do this." For a tense moment, no one spoke. The men seemed torn, their loyalty to the HOA warring with their own sense of responsibility and concern for the community. Finally, one of the men stepped forward, his face set with determination. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we have our orders. We have to do this." With that, he began to shovel dirt into the drainage pipe, quickly followed by the others. Sarah watched in horror as the water began to pool around her feet, the realization dawning that she had lost this battle. As the last of the dirt was shoveled in, the men turned and walked away, leaving Sarah standing alone in the gathering darkness, her heart heavy with dread. The rain started to fall just as the sun disappeared behind the horizon, casting an ominous shadow over Sarah's backyard. She watched helplessly as the water began to pool, slowly but surely, creeping up the side of her home. Panic gripped her as she realized the full extent of the disaster that was unfolding. The HOA had willfully ignored her warnings, and now her worst fears were coming true. If the water continued to rise, it would only be a matter of time before it started to seep into her basement, potentially causing thousands of dollars in damage. With a sense of growing dread, Sarah rushed inside and began to gather sandbags and other emergency supplies, desperately trying to stave off the impending flood. She knew that it was a losing battle, but she couldn't just stand by and watch her home be destroyed. As she worked tirelessly through the night, the rain continued to pour, and the water level steadily rose. Sarah's muscles ached, and her fingers were raw from the constant effort, but she refused to give up. She had to find a way to stop the flood, no matter the cost. Just as the first rays of dawn began to peek over the horizon, Sarah heard a commotion outside. Peering through the window, she saw a group of panicked neighbors gathered around the HOA meeting hall, their faces etched with a mix of shock and horror. Dropping everything, Sarah rushed outside, her heart pounding in her chest. What she saw next made her stomach churn. The once pristine meeting hall was now submerged in a murky pool of floodwater, its windows shattered and its doors hanging open. Sarah's mind raced as she put the pieces together. The HOA's decision to force her to block the drainage pipe had backfired spectacularly, flooding their own meeting hall and likely causing untold damage to the surrounding properties. As the stunned neighbors began to survey the damage, Sarah couldn't help but feel a twinge of satisfaction. After all, she had warned them about the consequences of their actions, but they had refused to listen. Now they were facing the full brunt of their own arrogance and disregard for her concerns. But even as she took in the scene, Sarah's heart sank. She knew that the damage to her own home was still very much a reality, and that she would have to deal with the aftermath of the HOA's reckless decision for weeks, if not months, to come. With a deep sigh, she turned and headed back inside, her mind already racing with a plan to file a formal complaint and seek restitution from the HOA. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. As the sun rose higher in the sky, the extent of the damage became increasingly clear. The floodwaters had not only inundated the HOA meeting hall, but had also crept into several neighboring homes, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. Sarah watched from her window as emergency crews arrived on the scene, quickly deploying pumps and sandbags in a desperate attempt to stem the tide. Nearby residents, some still in their pajamas, frantically gathered their belongings and sought higher ground, their faces etched with a mix of fear and disbelief. Amidst the chaos, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. She had tried to warn the HOA, had pleaded with them to reconsider their reckless decision, but they had stubbornly refused to listen. Now, their arrogance and unwillingness to compromise had come back to haunt them in the most dramatic way possible. As the cleanup efforts continued, Sarah received a call from an unexpected source. Thomas, the HOA president. "Miss Blackwood," he said, his voice strained and unsteady. I don't know how to say this, but you were right. We made a terrible mistake, and now we're all paying the price for it." Sarah listened in silence, her mind racing with a mixture of emotions. Part of her wanted to gloat, to rub his face in the consequences of his actions, but another part of her felt a twinge of sympathy for the man. He sounded genuinely shaken, a far cry from the confident and dismissive individual she had confronted just days earlier. "I know you warned us, Sarah," Thomas continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I'm so sorry we didn't listen. We were blinded by our own sense of power and control, and now look at the mess we've made." Sarah took a deep breath, weighing her words carefully. "Thomas, I appreciate your apology, but the damage has already been done. My home is still at risk, and the cleanup and repairs are going to be a nightmare. What do you plan to do about that?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Sarah could almost hear the wheels turning in Thomas's mind. I don't know, to be honest. The HOA's insurance policy may cover some of the costs, but I'm not sure how much. And the legal implications. Well, let's just say we have a lot of work ahead of us." Sarah nodded, her expression grim. "I'm going to be filing a formal complaint, Thomas, and I'm not going to stop until I'm fully reimbursed for the damage to my property. This isn't over, not by a long shot." "I understand," Thomas replied, his voice heavy with resignation. We brought this on ourselves, and we're going to have to face the consequences. I just hope that somehow we can make this right." As the call ended, Sarah turned her attention back to the chaos outside, her mind already racing with the next steps in her fight against the HOA. She knew that this was far from over, but she was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. In the days that followed, the aftermath of the HOA's disastrous decision continued to unfold. The floodwaters had caused extensive damage to the meeting hall, rendering it unusable for the foreseeable future. Nearby homeowners also reported significant flooding in their basements and yards, with several families forced to temporarily relocate while repairs were made. Throughout the chaos, Sarah remained steadfast in her pursuit of justice. She had filed a formal complaint with the local authorities, detailing the HOA's reckless actions and the resulting damage to her property. Armed with a stack of evidence and a tenacious spirit, she was determined to hold the HOA accountable for their mistakes. The HOA, for their part, had been thrown into a state of turmoil. Thomas, the once confident president, now found himself on the defensive, scrambling to mitigate the legal and financial fallout of the incident. He had reached out to Sarah on several occasions, pleading for a chance to make amends, but Sarah remained unmoved. "You had your chance to listen to me, Thomas," she said, her voice laced with a mixture of anger and determination. "Now you're going to have to face the consequences of your actions, just like the rest of us." The HOA's insurance provider, however, proved to be less than cooperative. Citing a clause in the policy that excluded coverage for acts of negligence or willful disregard for community guidelines, they refused to cover the full extent of the damage, leaving the HOA to foot a significant portion of the bill. As the cleanup and repairs dragged on, tensions within the community continued to escalate. Homeowners who had been affected by the flooding grew increasingly frustrated with the HOA's handling of the situation, with some even threatening to withhold their dues until the issue was resolved. Sarah, meanwhile, remained steadfast in her pursuit of restitution. She had retained a team of lawyers who were working tirelessly to build her case, determined to ensure that the HOA was held accountable for their actions. "This isn't just about me anymore," Sarah said, her eyes burning with a fierce determination. "This is about the entire community and the way the HOA has abused its power. They need to be held responsible, and I'm not going to stop until that happens." As the legal battle raged on, the HOA found itself increasingly isolated, its once formidable reputation crumbling under the weight of its own mistakes. Sarah, on the other hand, emerged as a symbol of resistance, inspiring others in the community to stand up and fight against the HOA's heavy-handed tactics. It was a battle of wills, a clash between the arrogance of power and the resilience of the human spirit, and as the dust began to settle, it became clear that the outcome would have far-reaching consequences for the entire community. The courtroom was tense as Sarah and the HOA's legal team faced off, each side determined to emerge victorious. The battle had been long and arduous, with countless hours of depositions, evidence gathering, and legal maneuvering, but Sarah remained undaunted. As the judge listened intently, Sarah presented her case with a level of passion and conviction that left the opposing counsel visibly unsettled. She detailed the HOA's reckless decision to force her to block the drainage pipe, the resulting flood that had ravaged her property and that of her neighbors, and the HOA's subsequent attempts to avoid responsibility. The HOA's lawyers, in turn, tried to argue that Sarah's actions had contributed to the disaster, pointing to the fact that she had initially refused to comply with their directive. But Sarah was quick to counter, citing the overwhelming evidence that the HOA's decision had been a clear violation of local building codes and stormwater management regulations. As the proceedings wore on, the judge began to show clear signs of siding with Sarah. The HOA's attempts to shift the blame were falling flat, and the judge seemed increasingly troubled by the blatant disregard for the community's well-being demonstrated by the HOA's leadership. Finally, after hours of tense deliberation, the judge delivered his verdict. In a scathing ruling, he found the HOA liable for the damages caused by the flooding, ordering them to pay a substantial sum in restitution to Sarah and the other affected homeowners. The HOA's representatives sat in stunned silence, their faces etched with a mix of disbelief and humiliation. They had been so confident in their ability to wield power and control over the community, never imagining that they would be held accountable for their actions. As the courtroom erupted in a collective sigh of relief, Sarah stood tall, her eyes shining with a sense of triumph. She had fought a David and Goliath battle against the HOA, and she had emerged victorious. It was a victory not just for her, but for the entire community, a testament to the power of persistence, resilience, and the unwavering belief in doing what is right. As she walked out of the courthouse, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The HOA's reign of unchecked power had been broken, and the community had been given a chance to heal and move forward. It was a bittersweet moment, to be sure, but one that filled her with a renewed sense of hope for the future.